This talk is brought to you by the Bamberg Mathematical Consciousness Science Initiative.
So I'm going to just jump right in. I'm going to revisit the question everybody asks all the time, including major phenomenologists. What is phenomenology? And then what is mathematical phenomenology? And then this will take us to a discussion of the most salient features of consciousness, and then some problems with modeling those features mathematically. And then to Johannes's favorite question, I think, about the structure of consciousness, like per se, the structure of consciousness, which we might phrase as the mathematical essence of consciousness, if it has one. So, what is phenomenology? So, I would, to spare us all a long, frustrating discussion that would take up the next, a whole course. I'm going to endorse a more or less Husserlian understanding of phenomenology, at least in its descriptive and eidetic aspects. So, on that view, the phenomenology of X, of whatever, is the effort to describe systematically and reflectively to describe systematically the reflectively accessible structures, forms, and apparent invariants, like laws and essences, hence eidetic, characterizing the consciousness of X, where these forms and structures have both noetic, that is subjective, and noematic, or objective aspects. So, for example, a phenomenology of X also provides an eidetic description of the correlation between X, that's some domain of objects, or what Husserl called noemata, and our ways of consciously apprehending X. So that's how you relate the subjective and the objective aspects of it. There's the domain of objects, what you're conscious of, and then your consciousness of it, your way of experiencing it, your way of accessing it consciously. That's the noetic aspect. The noematic aspect is the objective, and the noetic, the subjective. Roughly speaking, a couple of examples may help. So this is sort of one that Husserl returns to over and over and over again, the idea that physical objects are always encountered via profiles through Abschattungen, or aspects, adumbrations. You look at an object and twirl it around, walk around it, and so on, through a play of retentions and protensions, and hyletic data, if you allow that there are such things, and correspondingly inherently revisable intentional animations. That is, you're getting different sort of, you might say, hyletic data sets, and you animate these as presentative of some object, but you could always be wrong, right? And your kind of history of retentions and successful protensions, that is kind of sort of anticipations of what will be next, will make you think, oh yes, either it is this kind of object that I've identified, that I've animated it as, or I am wrong and it's some other kind of object. So you see something scurry off into the bushes and you go, oh, I think it's a cat. And then you look closer and it's actually an opossum or something else. Right? And then you might have been wrong about that. And so it's inherently revisable. So that tells you both sort of the way physical objects appear, something about the objects themselves, and then something about our relationship to the objects, the dubitability, the play of retentions and protensions, our mode of access to the objects. Another example, one that's near and dear to Jean-Paul Sartre, the objects of imagination are always given as not existing, or not being present, or not being such and such, or at least not being known to be as imagined. So fictions or possible fictions, you might say. In perceptual imagination, these are given by imaginary profiles that, unlike real perceptual profiles, cannot surprise you. So if you want to rotate the object in imagination, it's not like you're going to, picture it rotating and then be, oh my God, look at the other side. It's not what I thought, right? Unlike real perceptual objects. Right? And the imaginer correspondingly doesn't believe in what is being imagined and is aware of contriving or sustaining the quasi-presence of the thing imagined. This is sort of straight out of Sartre's books on the imagination. Or how about this one? This is actually raised in a way by Ian Hacking's nice book on the history of probability theory called The Emergence of Probability. Probabilities are always encountered as having an objective side, which is, say, captured by frequentist and propensity interpretations of probability, and a subjective side captured as credences. So it's no accident that the axioms of probability theory can be interpreted in this dual way. So one is kind of an objective interpretation and one's kind of a subjective or noetic interpretation of it. But that makes sense if there's a kind of correlation between our experience of these purported objects or objectivities, as phenomenologists like to say, and our our attitude toward them, our credences. The objects of abstract thought, so we're kind of getting closer to our present topic, a cube as such, or a circle as such, or a theorem or a function, can also be grasped conceptually as atemporal totalities without perceptual Abschattungen, so without these aspects, but with what we might call conceptual Abschattungen. And here it's a bit different. That is the fact that, different from the perceptual case, which is always perspectival and requires time in a key way. This is more the fact that mathematical objects are always in principle capable of further conceptual articulation and connection, so that you never actually get all of the possible connections related to a particular mathematical object. So even if you have, say, a very clear conception of what a cube is, with all of its sides at once, there are many things you might go on to say about cubes in various kinds of spaces and so on. All right? So that's a kind of analog of perceptual profiles or Abschattungen, but it's not the same. So consciousness, this is something that Husserl and the other phenomenologists all would use in a way to characterize consciousness and distinguish it from other objects or other things that you might be aware of. Consciousness doesn't encounter itself by profiles. It nonetheless does encounter itself. And in reflection, it's given as having already been present and as continuing to stream in time consciousness. So when you reflect on it, it's not as if you're suddenly surprised at what you see. It's given as having already been present to you. So this distinction, this is a nice way of at least provisionally distinguishing consciousness from, say, physical objects. Physical objects are always given via profiles, but consciousness is given to itself without profiles. The last two are particularly relevant for thinking about mathematical phenomenology. So what is mathematical phenomenology? So it's important to realize that in a certain sense, and for certain objective domains of objects, mathematicians have been practicing mathematical phenomenology since at least Euclid, I would say. So the effort to axiomatize geometry, logic, set theory, arithmetic, probability theory, and notably the development of projective geometry, and surely many other areas, can be viewed as efforts to describe a domain of objects, eidetically characterize them, and thereby prescribe rules for working with them properly and opening their fields for further conceptual articulation. So these latter would be the more specific noetic side of the matter. So you've got the objects like number, like arithmetic relations, and sets, and then by characterizing them eidetically, you're also giving yourself rules and procedures for investigating them further and for dealing with them. And that's on the kind of noetic side of things versus noematic, on the side of you as a subject doing something and thinking about them in certain ways. And of course, the development of physics too provides instances of mathematical phenomenology. It still happens that physicists sometimes literally use the phrase phenomenological model in describing some system of phenomena that they hope to develop a mathematical model of. And here we have perhaps the key instance of what we might call the trans-noematic application of phenomenology. That is, we use an eidetics from one domain of objectivities, so certain types of mathematical objects, to characterize another domain, a certain domain or subdomain of physical objects. So physics is in the business of doing this all the time. And of course, this has been the geometry in a way arrives at eidetics from going the reverse direction, like historically, from investigating empirical objects, physical objects, and extracting their geometrical properties and then turning that into an eidetic. The question of mathematical phenomenology, as I see it anyway, is this: can we do the same thing for consciousness itself? So can we take a mathematics and apply it to the description of consciousness itself? So this again would be a trans-noematic application, but now not trying to characterize physical objects, but consciousness itself. I mean, if consciousness is a physical object, then okay, a special one. So Husserl, even though himself a mathematician and occasionally using quasi-mathematical diagrams and notations for illustrating phenomenological points, did not think so. At least that's how I read him on the issue. But be the opinion of the master as it may, as long as consciousness has reflectively accessible apparent structures, and it surely does, there would seem to be no a priori reason that we cannot attempt to characterize those structures using mathematical models. But we must remember that in doing this, we are treating consciousness as a certain kind of object, an objectivity, if you like, that is also a subjectivity. I myself have no problem with this idea, though many people do. I guess we could call it the subject. Subject. Anyway, being silly. This effort presupposes another controversial point, namely that we can generally tell the difference between the eminent features of consciousness, like those features that are truly features of consciousness, and transcendencies or objects of consciousness. What do I mean here? Well, to illustrate, there's a hoary debate, a very old debate, about whether the qualitative objects of sensory experience, like pains and felt temperatures and colors and odors and so on, are actually properties of consciousness itself, or merely some sort of intentional objects of consciousness. And how you come down on this question will have radically different implications for what you take any mathematical phenomenology of this aspect of consciousness to be. If you're more in line with sense datum theory or a Husserlian theory, and you have sensory Hule, as he called them, you'll think that your mathematical model of, or theory of sensory qualities is ipso facto a model of an aspect of consciousness itself. If you're more in line with intentionalism, or what's sometimes called representationalism, you will not necessarily think this. You might even think that the contrary position rests on an obvious fallacy, and there's this idea that, so it's called the sense datum fallacy. Like if you hallucinate an orange, can you infer that there is something orange, even though it's not, an orange? Is there's nonetheless something orange, and that is sort of branded a fallacy. But if you're a sense datum theorist, you're going to be like, no, it's not a fallacy. I'm just actually directly aware of some aspect of consciousness that I then kind of objectify. So how you come down on that is going to send you down very different directions. So if you're fairly radical in your intentionalism, you might think that the very idea of a mathematical phenomenology is a non-starter, because consciousness, on that view, doesn't have access to any of its own structure and only ever reveals objectivities other than consciousness. So you might think that no, consciousness is just this kind of empty awareness of other things. And when you talk about structures of stuff, it's really the structure of the world or the structure of objects. That's not the structure of consciousness. Well, if you go down that route, you can forget about mathematical phenomenology. Not that that's not a reason, a reason not to go down that route, because then we wouldn't have a discipline. But I think like there are independent reasons for rejecting intentionalism, but just saying, some people have held that kind of view, and they might think the very conception of mathematical phenomenology is just half-baked for that reason. So suppose we think, as I do, that extreme forms of intentionalism are untenable. What then? Then mathematical phenomenology would become the application of suitable mathematical frameworks for the systematic eidetic description of consciousness itself and not of other domains of objects. And presumably, the features that are most promising for an eidetic characterization are the most salient and universal ones. And once we have that, we can systematically map out the various subdomains up to some limit of specificity. And once we have that, then, that's what I meant to say, once we have that, then we can systematically map out the various subdomains up to some limit of specificity and concreteness. So in other words, start with the most general universal features and work your way down to more specific things. In other words, the most salient and apparently invariant features of consciousness are the ones to target first, and we can worry later about how we might mathematically characterize what it was like to eat cold purple brain-like cabbage while tripping on LSD and listening to Pink Floyd and so on. Like some very specific experience. So if you start with the very, very concrete and specific experience, you're going to be like, yeah, the problem is just totally intractable. So what are these features? My list is more or less the usual one, and I should say it may be incomplete. There's qualitative character and there's intentional character, and there are endless debates about the relationship between these two. But qualitative character, the world appears to you a certain way, you appear to yourself a certain way, and you have various sensory and qualitative experiences. And then intentional character, you have a consciousness of things, perceptual objects, mathematical objects, and so on. And there's subjective character or subjectivity. It all appears to you, to someone, and you have a point of view on it. And then there are temporality. It's occurring through time, which involves a unification of time, your retention of past time and integrating it to the present and anticipating the future, and synchronic unity. So you're also simultaneously experiencing the world through many different modalities, many different perceptual modalities, many different cognitive modalities all at once. These features interpenetrate one another. We can reduce qualitative and intentional content, but arguably there's always some minimal content component. So even if you try to achieve pure consciousness by evacuating consciousness of your sensory experience, you get into the sensory deprivation tank and meditate and try to stop thinking, there's still, I would argue, some kind of minimal content component that if you really scraped it down would have to do with your embodiment. And there's no such thing as the manifestation of a content component that's not manifested to consciousness, and this manifestation to is an aspect of subjectivity. And synchronic unity applies as much to the co-manifestation of disparate contents, like you hear a sound and you see the object and you hear it at the same time. It applies as much to that as it does to the co-manifestations of content and subjectivity itself. And of course, there's no manifestation of anything at all, at least for we poor humans, without internal time consciousness. So can we characterize these features mathematically? This is the best back of the napkin diagram I've ever drawn. That's why I trot it out in like every other talk I give. But there've been I'll get to it. There have been significant efforts to characterize some of these features mathematically, and I want to mention some of them and some remaining difficulties. And forgive me for my paucity of citations and name drops. I mean, the whole thing could be filled with citations. So, um, qualitative character. So presupposing that strong intentionalism about qualitative character is false, and that it's not just about the qualities of the objects. I like the old Leibnizian idea that so-called, what he called confused ideas, appear to us qualitatively because of our analytical limitations. So he thought, like, for God, like, their structure is absolutely transparent. For us, because we cannot perform infinite analyses, as he liked to put it, they seem qualitative. So Leibniz is, on this and related points, a hero, you might know, of Gregory Chaitin, you know, one of the fathers of algorithmic information theory. And I think, as others have argued, see G. Ruffini's talk at MOC5, that notions from AIT, algorithmic information theory, or Kolmogorov complexity theory, and the theory of Turing degrees could possibly play a role in modeling qualitative character. The idea would be that qualitative character is something like, it results from, if you like, something like degrees of recursive unsolvability, but relative to consciousness, thought of in some kind of computational terms, as hand wavy as this claim remains. So it wouldn't be like literally the theory of Turing degrees, but it's something like it. Perhaps then we might be able to understand why qualitative character divides into organized or ordered hyletic fields, what Husserl called hyletic fields, that are otherwise heterogeneous. So you have the visual spectrum, you have the auditory spectrum, and you have various kinds of spectra, but the qualitative fields themselves are kind of heterogeneous. Like, you recognize that they're all qualities, but like a sound is not a sight. You know, something you see, you know, the visual colors are not sounds, and so on. And what makes them branch into these different fields, and then why within each field do they have that kind of ordered structure? Can we derive that from a mathematical theory, rather than just sort of try to empirically, you know, work it out and describe it? So, so that's an idea. So intentional character. So apart from the idea that perceptual intentionality involves the animation of hyletic and qualitative data, which is what I try to represent here with these little functions, and H meaning hyletic data, and perhaps, apart from that, and the idea that this animation could be thought of as being like a function of some sort, but then that gets tricky when you deal with perceptual bistability. I'm afraid that I remain pretty skeptical about the prospect of a mathematical characterization of intentionality per se, or any reductive characterization of it for that matter. So it doesn't seem to me that it can be thought of as a matter of similarity, even more sophisticated kinds of similarity like homeomorphism. And I'm skeptical that it can be thought of in terms of inference, where inference is characterized extrinsically in a network fashion as an inferentialism. Otherwise, if you don't do it extrinsically, then it just becomes circular, because inferences themselves are intentional entities. So I'm kind of like, I remain pretty doggedly pessimistic about intentionality, I'm sad to say. So what about subjective character? Well, I like to divide subjective character into at least the following components: pre-reflective self-consciousness, which I literally think of as consciousness being directly acquainted with itself; viewpoint or perspectival character; proto-intersubjectivity, the fact that you're always ready to be seen and to be dealt with by another subject from another point of view; and the sense of individuality, or what we might call knowledge de se. So the sense of subjectivity, or subjective character, also arguably includes a sense of agency and affectivity, but I leave these to the side here. So I've proposed models of pre-reflective self-consciousness and de se knowledge that use hyperset theory, or the theory of non-well-founded sets, to model the relevant structure. And David Rudroff and Daniel Bencan, Gregoire Sergent-Pertuis, and I, along with other collaborators like Carl Friston and Greg Landine, have proposed the PCM, the projective consciousness model, which is a theory of point of view, basically. However, David and Daniel and I have argued that it could also capture certain aspects of pre-reflective self-consciousness and provide a basis for proto-intersubjectivity, and this has to do with the kind of reciprocity property inherent in a projective space. And there are some other suggestive properties. So the PCM would, of course, capture our basic sense of spatiality, which should arguably be on our list, our initial list of all the salient features of consciousness. But here are some outstanding problems in this connection. So I find it convincing enough that the a priori form, to use Kantian lingo, of all consciousness is projective geometrical. So it's not just a matter of the visual point of view, where projective geometry applies most intuitively, but this does need to be clarified, I think, further. I think Bertrand Russell actually argued in 1899 that only projective geometry could provide you with a framework to get some notion of externality. It's like something being before you. And I think that's, I agree with that. So, and that would apply whether it's visual or not. And then Merleau-Ponty actually has an implicit commitment to projective geometry in the Phenomenology of Perception, where he thinks of Gestalt character as sort of essential to conscious experience. And if you scratch, Gestalt character ends up involving projective geometry. So some of the same old questions about Kant's idea of Euclidean space as the a priori form of outer intuition, however, apply here as well. It's clear that the perspectival character of consciousness can't be externalized, since there are no projective origins, horizons, etc., in a purely Euclidean space. And it's always kind of I don't know what the right word is, disconcerting to see people with very strong externalist intuitions try to do this, which Sartre tries to do in his chapter on embodiment in Being and Nothingness, and then people like Christopher Hill and other kind of externalist representationalists try to do in analytic philosophy. Like they're trying to turn things like perspectival character, like make it an objective property of an external object to preserve their externalism and representationalism, and it just fails pretty miserably, I think. But does this mean that we can treat the a priori form of conscious experience as if it were a structure of consciousness itself, which is kind of like what we do in the PCM? We'll say things like, it structures consciousness. What does that mean exactly? My tendency is to think of it as like, okay, it means that this literally is the structure that consciousness has. So is that correct, or is that kind of, a mistake of some sort? So I think that requires further elucidation. Finally, we can derive something like, or something equivalent to, can we derive something equivalent to non-well-foundedness? It's not clear to me that we can. If we can't, I will have to conclude that pre-reflective self-consciousness is in some way independent of point of view, and that pre-reflective self-consciousness doesn't reduce to point of view, that they're just independent components of subjective character. I would like to try to unify them, and Daniel and David and I kind of made some effort in this direction, but there's no, we certainly didn't succeed, I think, in just showing that if your consciousness is structured by projective space, then you get non-well-foundedness out of it. Okay, so what about temporality? Well, apart from Husserl's diagrams, like the very top one is based on one of Husserl's diagrams, and some set theoretical representations, like these on the bottom here, it's a graph theory way of doing it, but above you see these little sets. One of my first papers on this business, where you see this is a non-well-founded set because it's in its own membership chain. Cn is in Cn, and Cn, and so on. And then notice that Cn is also in, that's retention. It's being retended at point 2, but that point 1 also protends the next one. But if you took that very literally, then you took the transitive closure of all this. Then the transitive closure of every episode of consciousness would be identical. So there, which is I think problematic. So you have to at least think. You have to think that like when you retend. I mean, do you have that your past consciousness as literally a component? Like the past is literally a component of the present? That's wacky, right? Or that the future, the thing that hasn't happened yet. I mean, if you have certain theories of time, you could be like, yeah, I'm already dead, right? And or whatever, it's all already happened, man. But it's like, sometimes you feel like that, but this okay, I'm kind of hoping that a theory of consciousness doesn't have to be committed to that, which makes it seem like retention is kind of representational and protension is representational, but that has problems too. So anyway, apart from these kind of like sketches, I don't, which are themselves kind of superficial, I would venture to say that we haven't made that much progress in modeling time consciousness mathematically. But this may have more to do with time itself than with consciousness as such. So the issue is, I mean, again, I'm happy to be shown to be wrong about this, but the issue, as I at least see it now, is that the same is really the same old Bergsonian one. Remember Bergson, good old Bergson saying that geometrical and other representations of time and time consciousness, I would argue, capture only one aspect, namely ordering, and miss something essential to time. And for Bergson, you simply can't capture it in abstractly like that. You just got to live it, man. So what is this? What is this something essential? It's this bizarre fact that time and time consciousness can be aptly described as duration, like this is Bergson's La Durée, or the Nunc stans of St. Augustine. He didn't use the phrase, but his heirs certainly did, like the eternal present or eternal now. And as a perpetual flight, Husserl's Heraclitean flux, as if experiences and events both change and remain, but the change eventually swamps the remaining, as if they have like degrees of existence. This is a theory that Quentin Smith once proposed, that maybe, things in the immediate past just exist more than things in the remote past. And maybe if we get far enough into the future, they'll quit existing. Right? But anyway, for example, Sartre's idea that, so to speak, one is and is not one's immediate retended past has a certain phenomenological aptness to it in spite of its being literally inconsistent. So recently, Graham Priest, I say recently, it's like 15, 20 years ago. Recently, it still exists to a certain degree. Graham Priest has tried to resuscitate the Hegelian paraconsistent theory of motion, where like, an arrow is at a location and isn't, and apply it to time as such. And Di Huang recently, much more recently, tried to adapt Priest's effort to time consciousness, partly motivated by Sartre's own paraconsistent looking account. I remain skeptical. That may be because I'm terribly allergic to paraconsistency and dialetheism. I want things to be consistent, because I feel like, if you read Graham Priest, like read In Contradiction, you can just feel like he's grinding your mind down into dust. Like, you're losing all your hold on everything. So I have a hunch that there might be something interesting in the area of nilpotent infinitesimals, as the theory's been worked out by John Bell, and he's made this suggestion himself. So here we would not be abandoning non-contradiction, but abandoning excluded middle in certain special cases. And I'm less allergic to abandoning excluded middle than I am to non-contradiction. All right, so we're getting close to the end. So synchronic unity, say what you will, I think that IIT was and remains most plausibly an effort to capture synchronic unity mathematically. And I would certainly never begrudge it for that. Björn Merker and David Rudolph and I have argued that it's more hegemonic aims are not tenable, though I, for one, and for the record, would not call it pseudoscience, and I didn't sign that letter. I wasn't asked to, but I wouldn't have if I was asked. I agree with those who have argued that in the arena of consciousness, it's too early to say what is scientific and what isn't. I mean, for the most part, obviously we could like find some really extreme, crazy stuff and be like, yeah, that's not science. Right? But I am Feyerabendian enough to think that, for example, astrology or design theory might have turned out to be parts of science, but they didn't, right? And thank God, right? But like just a priori, like, I don't know, maybe the stars, have something to do with why, your personality. I mean, who knows? Right? So I don't think you can just, once you realize that like the Popperian way of trying to demarcate science from non-science doesn't work, then we're all, going to have to rely on like the long playing out of Bayesian confirmation theory, basically. So, it's a little too early to be going, you're a pseudoscientist. I mean, you could just imagine it kind of going back and forth. Like, it's almost like, anyway. So we need a theory of synchronic unity, and for all I know, something like IIT could be on the right track. In models I myself have proposed, synchronic unity is simply presupposed and just comes down to a matter of membership and the transitive closure of a certain kind of set. And I think that's hardly a very deep account of synchronic unity. Like, well, this element belongs to it, and so does that. So what's your problem, right? And in the PCM, the projective consciousness model, we've assumed that there's multimodal integration and modeled it computationally using simulacra of free energy minimization or other optimization algorithms. But in my view, this falls short of offering a full-blown theory of how different modalities are synchronically unified. Rather, the simulations merely reflect the fact itself, as do the membership relations or the arrows representing them in directed graphs. So there's much work to be done here, I think. Note that there's a special connection here between the theory of qualitative character and intentional character and synchronic unity. Since the different sensory modalities, anyway, must fit together and be projectively framed, I would say, in very specific ways, so that, for example, we can know when we're touching and seeing the same thing or hearing and feeling the same loud vibration and so on. There's some mathematical work on the global workspace model of consciousness that might end up being relevant here. Like I'm thinking of Roderick Wallace's 2005 book. And in working on the PCM, we've always been mindful about what is right about global workspace theory. So finally, last slide, to say something, or penultimate slide, to say something about where all this might lead and about Johannes's favorite problem. So let me say this. Notice that in this discussion, I've mentioned several different branches and sub-branches of mathematics and logic, which I regard as part of mathematics. Nominal founded set theory, projective geometry, algorithmic information theory, the theory of Turing degrees, paraconsistent logic, God forbid, nilpotent infinitesimals, probability theory, information theory, optimization theory, and of course we could mention other areas and sub-areas often invoked in the effort to characterize aspects of consciousness. Category theory, metamathematics, modal logic, the theory of Markov decision processes, etc. So this apparent heterogeneity, of course, could be a sign of the fact that the effort is in its infancy. And that's certainly a plausible thought. But what if it turns out that the phenomenologically salient aspects of consciousness require a certain heterogeneity of models for their accurate characterization? Then we might encounter something roughly analogous to physics. I'm thinking of the outstanding problem of unifying quantum mechanics and relativity. In other words, eidetically, consciousness might just turn out to be ugly and like some sort of product of weaving together these distinct elements. But just as the quest for a grand unified theory has not let failure stop it, we will no doubt always try to find an elegant mathematical characterization of consciousness that captures all its essential features in one coherent framework. Mathematically, this may end up looking like finding an object in a single sufficiently general framework that has components that can be described in terms of these more specific, quote unquote, local mathematical frameworks, sort of analogous to, like, it behaves in a Newtonian way under these conditions. The latter would correspond to the salient phenomenological features of consciousness with which we began. So maybe we begin with these different features. We just use whatever mathematics seems to make sense. Suppose we develop reasonable models of all of these, but it's a very heterogeneous mathematical framework. Then the thought can be, okay, how do we like unify these into one coherent mathematical framework that captures them all in a nice and elegant way? And if we did that, we could go, see, now we've captured the essence of consciousness, the actual structure of consciousness, the sort of unique structure of consciousness. Otherwise, we might just be stuck with like, well, this works over here, that works over there. So thank you all very much, and